Hey Daniel, my name's Alexander Maguire, student number 102474883, and this is my Assessment 3 video response to the Uber Air crisis simulation. So for phase 1 of the simulation, I settled with option 1, and the majority of the cohort opted for option 2. I based my decision in part due to the framing of the question and due to real-life dealings with CASA and Air Services Australia, having worked in the aviation industry since 2015. So while the context of phase 1 did state that CASA had approved regulations allowing air taxis to operate in low-level airspace and that the Nexus drone had passed experimental and prototype flight testing, I did recognise a potential setback. So CASA does not actually govern the airworthiness standards for experimental aircraft. That's instead handled by Air Services Australia. CASA does, however, play a pretty major role in the final airworthiness test, and they're extremely stringent with their testing and operational standards. So CASA describes their risk appetite as low as reasonably practicable. This coincided with the reluctancy of Bell's engineers to state the aircraft will be ready on time, and with rumours of project delays circulating, is what ultimately led me to choose option 1. Without definitively knowing if CASA and Air Service Australia were or are cooperating, whether they had similar safety standards or whether the aircraft would be ready for testing in 2 months, I determined that it would not be unwise for the risk team to, have the wheels in motion for an exit strategy. So this doesn't necessarily mean fully committing to adopting an already approved commercial airframe, rather just preparing for the worst case scenario. Without an approved aircraft, none of the other concerns raised are even really relevant. It seems concerning that after years of development, that Bell wouldn't definitively state whether or not the airframe would be completed on time when they were only 6 months out from the scheduled launch date, and I think only 2 months until the testing phase was due to begin. So the ethics of this decision didn't really cross my mind, as it seemed that Bell's lack of communication justified Uber's choice to potentially adopt a different airframe. So in hindsight, I do believe this decision was made in haste and came from a personal point of view rather than putting myself in the shoes of an Uber risk management or crisis management team member. I believe that both my and the cohort's response to the situation followed the agility theory. There was definitely a want to act as efficiently as possible and begin allocating resources immediately before actually identifying the threat and then strategizing ways to effectively mitigate that threat. It's closely coupled with the high reliability theory principle of preoccupation with failure. Fear of launch setbacks due to development delays or due to Air Services Australia testing system delays trigger the response to act immediately to avoid any failure. So if I could redo the simulation, I'd probably have followed the principle of sensitivity to operations from the high reliability theory and opted for the do nothing approach, which I think was option 5. This could have included waiting for more information to present itself or engaging with key stakeholders to identify which, if any, of the listed threats were likely to transpire. The threat was assumed and resources would be dispersed before properly analysing the situation and sort of piecing together to find the big picture. The information provided at that time wasn't sufficient to make a sound decision, as there's still so much uncertainty as to what the setback was. So as stated in the context, Melbourne City Council were approving landing pad development slower than anticipated, so the setback rumours may very well have been in relation to the building approvals, and this turned out to be the case and led us into phase 2 of the simulation. Okay, so for phase 2, protesters were concerned with aircraft noise pollution, and that led to the announcement from the council that they were going to halt the development of all Uber Air infrastructure by cancelling all landing pad approvals. So for this phase, I opted with option 2, and so did the majority of the cohort. While I was concerned with acting in the interest of the Melbourne public, I decided to follow a utilitarian approach because in the overall scheme of things, by launching on schedule, thanks to state government intervention, Uber could actually act in their best interest while also producing the greatest good for the greatest number of people. So Uber also needs to consider the obligation they have to their shareholders and act in their best interests. the economic benefits of new building developments and the jobs that would be created in Melbourne and Victoria as a result, the further economic benefits from increased tourism, as was the case in Singapore, the potential for new innovative technology investments in the country, and the likelihood of decreased congestion in the Melbourne CBD in future. I think that last point is of particular interest because despite Melbourne City Council announcing their intentions to cease building plans due to the noise complaints, they'd actually already implemented measures to strategically place landing pads in areas where aircraft noise would not impact the surrounding environment. It almost seems as if their decision had been largely swayed by public pressure in the wake of an upcoming election, and their true objective was to actually proceed with all the development plans. All right. Okay, so all the other options I think they would have likely resulted in rollout delays, and none actually alluded to the program ceasing altogether, rather just delaying the inevitable. Whether this was the most ethical decision is subjective, but I acted under the belief that regardless of what a small portion of the public want, progress and change are inevitable, and Melbourne City Council should have just stuck to their guns rather than bowing to public pressure in the hopes of being re-elected. So public opinion really should have been considered and dealt with by the Melbourne City Council before approving the majority of the plans. It would be pretty unrealistic to expect Uber to take the loss and just accept Council's decision, especially 6 months out from the launch date. Uber was well within their right, in my opinion, to request the state government to take control of the approval process. And it's safe to assume that the Victorian government was already on board with the project as they, one, passed regulations allowing low-level air taxi operations over the CBD. And the state government was also really well aware of the vast economic value the initiative would have brought to the region. Okay. So as well as the desire to avoid a delayed launch date, there were several other considerations that reinforced my choice of decision 2 over the other alternatives. Engaging in a legal battle with the council would have been costly to Uber Air and would almost certainly result in increased public disdain. A legal battle would also sever ties, I guess, with the council, and a poor relationship between the two parties would no doubt cause complications in the future. I mean, it's not an ideal situation. The charm offensive, so that came across as a little bit patronising or even akin to a bribe, with little or no evidence to support that the plan would actually win over the public. I can entertain the idea of the mea culpa decision being the most ethical of the choices. However, I would argue that the opinion of a minority really shouldn't outweigh the opinion of the majority. On that note, also limiting the infrastructure and flight paths would inhibit the project from reaching its full market potential and increase the likelihood of financial losses and business unsustainability. All right, so I think disaster incubation theory can provide an explanation as to why the council cancelled all the building plans. Uber should have really had the foresight to recognise that there would be some discontent from the public and have plans implemented already to remedy the issue. The tight coupling and complexity of Uber's systems could explain the knock-on effect from public backlash to the termination of the building plans to potentially having the project halted altogether. There may have been a preoccupation with other potential threats from CASA, Air Services Australia and Bell, meaning the threat of public condemnation may have just fallen by the wayside. The Uber team may also have been operating under the assumption that Melbourne City Council would handle the concerns of local residents, or even had the assumption that most plans having already been approved, there was actually no need to win the public over. It was all sorted. By, I guess, loosening the coupling of their system, Uber found an alternative method of achieving their goal by seeking state government intervention and removing their reliance on the Melbourne City Council. So, doing so avoided the disturbance propagating and cascading through the organisation. Tightly coupled systems work great when everything is going to plan by minimising the number of stakeholders to deal with. However, tight coupling can cause systems to collapse when a problem arises. An effective analysis of the risk environment would have, I guess, better identified and mitigated potential risks early on rather than allowing problems to incubate and worsen. Okay, so that leads us on to phase 3. So for phase 3, I chose option 1, which was narrowly beaten by the cohort's vote of option 3. Option 2 was easy for me to disregard as the Victorian government was already on board and had taken control of the approval process. it didn't really make sense to allocate the PR team to fight a battle that had already been won. And I guess excessive political pressure may have actually had the opposite of the intended effect and hindered the approval process. Option 3 proposed splitting the PR team's efforts across 2 separate fronts. One campaign to continue lobbying the government and the other to highlight the benefits Uber Air would bring to the city. So while I did like the latter of these 2 options, Uber's resources were already scarce. So splitting the PR team across 2 fronts seemed counterintuitive. In my opinion, option 1 was a more well-rounded strategy than option 3 and actually followed the high reliability theory of reluctance to simplify. Also, option 3 seemed as if it was cutting corners by spreading resources too thin and essentially doing, 2 half-assed jobs. Focusing on a single objective, which was to provide a forum for the locals to vent their frustrations, seemed like a better and more efficient allocation of resources. And I think the effect was it would minimise construction delays. It would have perhaps had the unintended benefit of taking pressure off the state government too, by calming the public and diverting frustrations away from them, and instead taking those frustrations back onto Uber to be dealt with in a constructive and a non-patronising way. So option 1 was also the most ethical decision. The majority of stakeholders and Victorians stood to benefit from the project launching on time. However, the forum to vent frustrations may have also acted as a platform to answer any criticism by reassuring frustrated locals that the impact of aerial taxis would be minimal, and then list all the measures really in place to ensure them of this, and also list the benefits that the program would bring to Melbourne, to Victoria, and to the rest of Australia. All right, thanks Daniel. That's me done.